We've got two special guests today. James Horner is a film scorer from, well, from Hollywood, I guess I would say, right? Although, I don't know, he might be from Britain for all I know. He's big British. So he'll tell us where he's from and what his background is. And he's also an alumnus of UCLA, so I thought it'd be very appropriate to not only to have him come here as one of the major film scorers in Hollywood at the present time. You've all seen films, I'm sure, with his scoring. And I think that's just about inevitable, I would say. Scott Lipscomb is one of our graduate students in systematic musicology. He's done some work on looking at aesthetics and the effects of scoring on audiences, all right, sort of the psychological aspect. And I invited him just to speak for about 10-15 minutes first. And then we're going to listen to James, all right? So James, why don't we watch what Scott's doing? And actually, I'm hoping that James might have some kind of reaction to Scott's work. Critical critique, in other words.
I'm going to block it. Where should I sit? I'll sit here.
Well, before we get into your own work, would you like to respond to this work? This is sort of the antithesis of what you do. Because basically this is this is pulling it apart, analyzing it from the point of view of aesthetics, psychology, of perception. I'm not asking you to give him
I'm a bad person to ask academic questions of, because I escaped academia right after working on my doctorate. I said, what have I done with my life? So I'm like the wrong person. The only comment that I can make as a musician or as a non-musician is when you watch a sequence that's so short, it's very hard for me to figure out, you know, what music might be appropriate or what music might not be appropriate. And if this was part of a longer sequence, the sort of vivacious, fun music might be much more appropriate than the sort of isolated little sequence you saw. I mean, if it was all part of a longer thing, it's really difficult to tell. And there are also really good cases to be made, especially now with musical tastes being a little bit more different than the sort of 1930s, 1940s style of composing. Well, let's say 2001, where you take pre-existing waltzes or avant-garde music and you put it against images that, had it been given to a regular film composer, would have been completely different. And a lot of this is sort of hindsight. I mean, it's really hard to talk about it. I mean, I saw 2001 there was a score originally written for 2001 which was thrown out by Stanley Kubrick. He said, no, this isn't what I want at all. And he threw it out. And I saw part of the score, this was 20 years ago, I saw part of the score against the film. And it's really, really interesting because it's a very traditional movie score, just like you'd expect with action and stuff happening. And then you see the Ligeti or the Strauss against the movie, and you say, now that's the way to do it. But again, it's all sort of in hindsight. And I find that my own tastes or my own sensibilities are much more leaning towards a non-traditional approach than sort of a movie scoring approach. And that's the only thing, that's the only way I have of sort of responding. In the racket I've sort of fallen into, composing for films, ideally I like to think of myself as like a Joseph Haydn, you know, in Prince Esterhazy's court, hired to write a piece, given a court orchestra to play it, paid for it, and it's used. But it's actually very complicated in that the people that are asking you to write the music come from all kinds of different backgrounds. Some of them are people that don't know the first thing about classical music, don't know anything about movie music. They grew up in the 60s, and the 60s songs are what they know. And so when they ask you to do the music for a movie, they don't know anything past 60 songs. When you say, you know, it'd be great to use a flute, or it'd be great to use a chorus, or it'd be great to use this, they look at you with a blank stare. They don't have a clue. Whereas if you say, I want to record it with the Stones, or I want to record it with an Elvis song, or I want to record it, that means something. And there are quite a few composers, there are quite a few directors now who come out of that aesthetic. A lot of the filmmakers that are making movies now are in their 40s and 50s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and they all came out of the 60s, and they're children of the 60s and music of the 60s. They're not well trained in music, nor do they know anything that's gone on before. So the only thing that I can say is that each job seems to be completely different from the last, and each person you work for has different sensibilities than the last. And you'd be shocked to talk to some of the directors that I've worked with. People that, besides them either being nice or bastards to deal with, what they can say in one sentence is sometimes mind-boggling. Either it's barely more than grunting. Sometimes it's the most eloquent statement. Directors, it's a very interesting art form, putting music against film on a commercial film where there's money to be made, where there's a studio that's putting up a tremendous amount of money, where no one wants a fiasco, where everybody wants a hit. It's a whole strange dynamic that's unique to movie making. Yeah.
James, I was wondering, we've been discussing the aesthetics of music. In other words, really looking at the sensation of music itself, the reason that people decide to select certain styles of music and be attracted to certain kinds of music, a musical taste, etc. What brought you into this world of film scoring in terms of your own background, your own musicianship, your own study, and why did you make this decision? And what kind of industry is it here? I mean, is this supposedly, as it's called, the center of the film industry? How have you fit into that, and why did you make this decision?
Well, I was working on a doctorate here, and I got to a point, and I was teaching, and I got to a point one day where I realized that I was studying composition. I grew up in London. I had gone to school in London. I started off graduate school at USC, then I moved over here, partly because I got a teaching job and I was broke. But I always was studying composition ever since I was 12, 13, and theory and counterpoint and orchestration and all of that. And I guess I got to a stage in my career here where I suddenly one day said, there's got to be more in life than this. Not so much more in life than composition, but more in life than working in an academic power base. So I made a decision to leave academia. And at the same time, I was sort of asked to do a student film, which I agreed to do. And so in a nutshell, I fell in love with film scoring. I found my niche. I had had it sort of up to here with getting pieces performed and begging for performances. And if you're given a performance, they'll only rehearse it for an hour, and it's a complicated piece, and you know it's going to be a disaster, but it's all you can do. So I lost heart in classical, the world of academia, grants, fellowships, that kind of thing. I lost confidence in it, and I had to make a niche for myself someplace else. And to answer the second part of your question, Hollywood seems to be the mecca for film scoring. London is an alternative, Munich is another alternative, but they're very much secondary to Los Angeles. Given my druthers, I would love to go back home to London, but I can't. Well, I can, but I can't make a living there. There's no film work there. The economy's in shambles. 95% of the movies that are being made are generated here, and they'll go to London to shoot it, or they'll go to England to shoot it for the castles or the green scenery, but it's all made by Paramount or Fox or any of the other big movie companies. So it's all generated from Los Angeles. So to be sort of a major participant, you pretty much have to be here to participate. So it's a double-edged sword for me, because I very much would prefer to be in London. And in terms of my career, I did low-budget film after low-budget film after low-budget film. And I think the only reason I was successful is that I knew how to work with an orchestra for very little money. I mean, that's how I had to get my serious pieces performed. So I went from low-budget film, horror movie to horror movie to horror movie, and then sort of gradually got a toehold doing more serious films.
The concept of so-called greatness and of the companies, I imagine, bidding for scorers, all these processes that go into who is going to do a particular film, who is great, what is a great score historically and in terms of the present. How are these decisions made, and how have you gotten to the point perhaps where you can be selective about this when the executive asks you or bids you versus others? Has it got more to do with money than the picture? Has it got more to do with your skills versus the quality?
It starts at aesthetics. Probably a director will say, I liked the music for that movie. Who did that movie? Can I have a meeting with him? That's usually how it starts. Sometimes the director has wanted somebody else, and that somebody else hasn't panned out, and they then say, well, who else can we get? Sometimes the director comes straight to you and says, I want you to do the music of my film. There's really not a bidding process. Usually what happens is a director needs a composer, and he'll either have somebody he wants to work with, and he'll ask that person to do the score, or he doesn't have anybody in particular, but he has 3 people he's interested in, and he'll meet them all and make a decision. It's really not so much done on money. Money seems to be a secondary aspect. What is very interesting is sometimes a director will ask you to do a film, and the director really, you feel miscast, because really what he wants is a rock and roll score, but he doesn't know that. Or a director will ask you to do a very conventional score on a movie that's very unconventional and could take a completely different approach. There's sort of no hard and fast about anything in Hollywood. Everybody's psyche is completely different, and it's like, it's very much in a way like sort of choosing a girlfriend or choosing a boyfriend, as the case may be. I mean, you don't sort of know what's all entailed till you really get involved. And then sometimes you say, oh my God. And sometimes you say, this person's great. But you don't know, because on the face of it, you know, you really can't tell. I mean, there are people I've worked with that are wonderful people. It tends to come out in their filmmaking. Then there are other people I've worked with that I'll say, life's too short. I will never work with that person again.
Could you outline some of these so-called agony and ecstasies, whatever you want to call these kinds of experiences, versus different films you've worked on?
An ideal
in
experience,
terms of your fulfillment.
An ideal experience for me is Field of Dreams. A horrid experience for me is Aliens. I feel like I don't ever want to see Jim Cameron again. And it's not just composers. It's sort of the whole entire crew as they work with a film. The people on the Abyss, the people say, I'll never work with him again. The actors on the Abyss say, I'll never do this again. And then, you know, Terminator 2 was a smaller cast in a way. But there's certain people that want to control the entire apparatus themselves. They don't know about the entire apparatus, and they are really very difficult to deal with. And Jim falls in that category. He would do it all if he could, but he can't. And he knows he can't. But he is one of those people that is not very good at sharing. Phil Robinson is the antithesis of that. And you can tell in the filmmaking. There's a great spiritual quality in Field of Dreams. Granted, they're different stories, but there's a great spiritual quality and softness in the film, and a magical quality, which you won't find in The Abyss. And the kind of projects that Jim Cameron is attracted to are these sort of high-tech visual psychodramas. Other directors, you know, would never do a film like that or aren't interested in that kind of a thing. So it's really, as I said, everybody has sort of a different aesthetic, and I don't think any director or producer I've worked with is the same as any other one.
James, I saw you a year ago when you were conducting the score to Glory, and I remember I came up to you during one of the breaks, and there was this huge number you had to do many times that was very much along the style of Carmina Burana. And I remember you looked at me at one point, because I was saying, my God, to have these forces at your will. And you said you'd be surprised how little power I actually wield. I thought that was a very interesting comment.
You sort of hang on for dear life sometimes. That's a good example. The last scene of Glory, the storming of the Bastille, as it were, the storming of Fort Wagner at the end, the director had put in temporary music, Carmina Burana, which most of you all know, and is certainly a big classical warhorse, so to speak. It's been used everywhere, on movies, in concerts, and it's a very popular piece. He put it in for this sequence, and he fell in love with it. He knew he couldn't get it. He knew he couldn't license it. He knew he couldn't have it, literally, but he asked me to write it sideways. And as a composer, as an artist, you say, right, well, if it's over here, you'll start over here. I know what he wants, I know what he's after. It has to be done with chorus and orchestra, it has to have a drive. And I would play it for him, and gradually over the course of the 3 weeks prior to the scoring sessions, he wasn't happy, he wasn't happy, he wasn't happy, he wasn't happy, until it was very close where I was uncomfortable with it legally, that I felt he had forced me into a position that I could either refuse to do the piece of music or apprise everybody that we had a legal problem and do it anyway, which I did. But when you know how to work the system, I knew that if I got too close to it legally, he would be really screwed, because he wouldn't be able to not only use my piece of music that I recorded, he still wouldn't be able to use the Carmina Burana. What would happen is that legally I'd be forced to record a third piece of music for the sequence, and the lawyers would be telling him, you can't have what you want, let James do the score, but legally he has to do this. Ed Zwick, the director, left me alone. I did a new sequence that was original music and put it in, and he ended up liking it much better than any of the stuff that we'd done before. But we never would have gotten to that point unless I had forced the issue by actually going legally too close to Carmina Burana, where we would have been sued by the estate. All of those things happen. It's fascinating. Sometimes directors, you know, put temporary music in a movie, and they will fall in love with it, and no composer alive can get him out of that way of thinking. That's how he starts thinking. He edits the movie with that music in it, he dreams about it, he thinks about it, or she thinks about it. Then when they come to hire the poor composer, and they say, the slate's clean, I don't have a preconception in my mind. You know, all it takes is 20 minutes with him at a piano, and you find out when he says, no, I don't like that, no, I don't like that, no, I don't like that. Well, in the temporary score, we did this, and that works very well for me. And you find that a lot of directors do that. That's part of working in Hollywood.
You said something of interest, James, at the beginning, that you consider yourself sort of a modern-day Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven.
Only in terms of composer, not in terms of stature.
No, but well, time will tell that. The history books 100 years from now will determine that. Actually, that's part of my question, is that, Roger, I think you're here, aren't you? Roger Borland? I saw him.
You just stepped
Oh, well, Russell, you're here.
Hi.
And who else are composers back there? All you people? All right. I see Sheridan there. The question of the contemporary composer of today, you found yourself in the situation of being in academia where you're continuing to write for orchestra, perhaps you're writing electronic music, and yet you find yourself in a situation that maybe Mozart wasn't really in. He was writing for a clientele, a very rich clientele, just like you are. Do you think that the contemporary composer today, in large part, is the film composer? Because so many times we confuse the idea of commerciality with the non-seriousness of music, or the non-seriousness of an artist. How do you look at yourself in that way?
Because there's so much money involved, I may be oversimplifying it. I think that there are two sort of streams of guys that do movie music. One are the people that do it to make a living, to do it to make money, as much money as they can make. And the other people that do it as an art form. And sometimes the two crisscross, but in Hollywood, the people I've run into, for the most part, are all most in it to make the money. And it's a completely different aesthetic. I work continuously on films where they don't have very much money to pay me. And that's beside the point to me, because to me it's the composition against the picture that's interesting. What happens is that I consider it as an art form no different than Mozart writing an opera and having you know, the prince, his benefactor, coming up to him and saying that too many notes. That's it. It's too many notes. And believe me, whether it's literally them saying it's too many notes or them saying, you know, this music feels just a little orange to me. It's the same response. You're working for the same aesthetic is there. You're just working for film instead of for opera, as in Mozart's case. But you still have your patron who comes up, who's employed you, whether it be the studio or the director or whatever, who says, I love it, or I'd like to change a little bit, or I like most of it, or whatever. So to me, it's very much an art form. But there are people who do it as a commodity and less as an art form, that see music as an income source. And so I'm not denigrating them, I'm just saying it's a different aesthetic altogether to the aesthetic I have. It's an aesthetic I understand but don't participate in. Like, for instance, I could never see myself doing music for Knots Landing and Barnaby Jones and any other show, Murder, She Wrote, 3 times a week. I couldn't see myself doing that. That's not part of my vocabulary. Not the literal shows, but the churning out of music like that. To me, that's a non-artistic art form. And there may be a subtle difference to you, but to me there's a major difference. I could never work that way. I've never done television for that reason. For me, I like to get hired on a project, whether it's to write a ballet or a film or an opera or whatever, and sequester myself for 6 weeks or 8 weeks and try and address it artistically, try and solve the problem artistically, and less as a commodity. And the problem with Hollywood is it's so seductive, it's so easy to be seduced. If you're asked to do 8 films a year, it represents a tremendous income. It's so easy to say, yeah, I'll do it. And then you do it, and after film after film after film, you become numb to the artistic process. You see it as a set of an 8-week or a 6-week commitment. You have to do the best job you can. You don't have time to really get as beautifully creative about it because you just don't have that kind of time. And so you get involved in a 6-week stint and you check out at the end of it, you get your next 6-week stint, and you become it becomes very much like a prostitute. And what happens over the course of time is you treat writing music as a commodity and less as an art form. And I think that that's what happens, and that's what the dark side of Hollywood, and that is very hard to resist.
Actually, that fits in very well with, I hate to bring up one of our sources, but remember McKay's idea of the monetary aesthetic versus these ideological versus what we might even call philosophical aesthetics. And yet some people can deal with this aesthetic through a career of, this is where the money's at, let me write the next landing for the next 10 years and I'll be happy, right? There are people like that in the industry.
Oh, absolutely. And I'll tell you that, again, not denigrating them, it's a way to make money, and if you're a musician or you're a flutist or you're a guitarist, why not? But as a for me, I just don't share that sensibility. Maybe it's having grown up in Europe. I do my best to really treat it as an art form. I mean, I'll give you an example. Abstract Expressionism, which was an era of, in painting primarily, music as well, but primarily painting. When you go to an art gallery, if you go down to the art gallery here in Los Angeles, and you look at Mark Rothko's paintings, or Frankenthaler's paintings, or any of the paintings, even French Impressionism, when you look at an artist's paintings, he will have done a painting for client number 1, and client number 2, and client number 3, client number 4, whatever. And you'll see them in an art gallery, and they look like one of a series. Now, when an artist, whoever that may be, Picasso, does sketches, a benefactor, somebody will hire Picasso to do a painting, and he'll do a painting for that client. Another client will approach Picasso and say, I'd like you to paint a painting for me too. And he will paint another painting. In his mind, his thought process is sometimes very similar, from painting number 1 to painting number 2 to painting number 3. That's the way artistically you think. You think in stretches. You did something on painting number 1 that you want to explore and extrapolate in painting number 2 and painting number 3. I went to an exhibition in London of Monet's paintings, and a whole room was dedicated to a series of paintings he did of just a river with weeping willows on the river. They were done for many, many various clients, benefactors, people that are hired him to do a painting. He had sold them all. But they all looked of an idea, of a thought. Now, in Hollywood, as a composer, as James Horner, I'll do a piece, an art piece, a movie score, and it'll look like that, and I'll finish it and it'll have a certain sound. And ideally, I would do another score, and I'd advance, I'd play with ideas that I established in the first score and extrapolate and make the second score different, but still of the same series. And I might do 4 or 5 scores in a row, given my druthers, or given my sense of wanting to experiment in composition. However, in Hollywood, every client you work for owns the music legally, lock, stock, and barrel. So even though I'm an artist and I'm painting a painting, it goes to Warner Brothers. Okay, fine. If I paint anything similar for 20th Century Fox, by rights, they can sue me. And by rights, 20th Century Fox can sue the owners of the first painting, because I'm using painting as an analogy, but composition is very peculiar in that aspect, that you can't do anything for one person that you do for another person, because that person owns the music entirely. And it's very different from painting, it's very different from dance, it's very different from anything else. And a lot of the reason it's different is because, again, the composer, whether he owns the music or not, and usually with mainstream films, the composer doesn't own any of the music. It all goes to the studio that's hiring him. Each project has to be completely aesthetically different than the last one. There's a big fuss now that Ennio Morricone wrote a score 2.5 years ago that he mimicked very, very closely in Bugsy. Different clients, but there's a huge thing, and he very well may get sued because the people that made Bugsy said, hey, that music that you wrote for our film doesn't, I mean, it's too close to this other score, and they own that music, and we're going to sue you. You told us you were going to do a whole new piece. Now, that's perhaps an extreme example, but in art, anything besides composing movie music, in art, you can write a piano piece, followed by another piano piece, followed by another piano piece, and they all feel like it's a progression of work. You're getting better, they're more advanced, they're more interesting as you go along, whatever. In film music, you can't do that. Each thing has to be a totally different thing. And it's quite a chore for an artist to do that. And it's unique to the filmmaking process.
In other words, many composers will literally embellish their own style piece to piece.
That's true.
And it's still their material.
I mean, you'll always be able to tell it's a Beethoven symphony. But I guarantee you, if I did Beethoven's Second Symphony for Warner Brothers and did Beethoven's First Symphony for Paramount, I would be in a lot of trouble.
So you've got to have a lot of
You have to,
different ideas.
it's a whole, again, it's a whole different aesthetic working in film. You have to learn how to completely sever yourself from what you've just done and not look back, which is very hard for any artist.
Extremely difficult for a musician, yeah, or any artist.
Any artist. And especially if you're steeped in classical music, as I am, much more so than popular music, it's really tough not to somehow recall a Benjamin Britten little riff, or a Prokofiev riff, or something that you always admired but you never know where it's from, and then you find out later it was a Bruckner or Mozart thing. It's really tough. And composition for film is unique in that aspect.
Do any of you have some questions? Yeah.
I have one question.
Yeah,
You
sure.
said something about how some of the directors might see your past work and they would want to kind of say, oh, I like that, and they hire you for a different film. Have you ever been forced where they kind of made you, even though you want to have a totally original idea for this new music, the director kind of might have clued you or hinted you to kind of make it sound like the piece that you wrote before? I mean, I heard the soundtrack to Star Trek 2 that you did, and then to Aliens, and it was very similar, and I was wondering if that happened there.
In Star Trek 2, well, actually, I have, a lot of this is, a lot depends on how much time you have, on how your relationship is going with the director, what kind of a film it is. I've had to say to a director, I don't want to do that. I've had to back out of a project on a couple of occasions because he's only wanted me to literally repeat myself. And I have excused myself from doing the project. Aliens was done in a week and a half. It was one of the things that that's why I said I will never work with Jim Cameron again. Aliens was done in a week and a half. And it was a horrible experience. And when you're on the stage, the recording stage, in front of a large symphony orchestra, as I was, and he comes out and he says, I don't like that. I don't like the end of that sequence. I don't like how it goes. It sounds like bullshit to me. And he says it just like that. No, James, could we just discuss this for a sec? It's just like that.
In front of everybody, yeah.
You just, it's not. I wasn't embarrassed or anything. I'm just saying, well, Jim, how do you want to solve it? And he said, well, can you change it? And can you do maybe a little closer to what you did in this? And that was great. That's what I really like. It's not worth it. There's a certain point at which you say, let me out of here. And whatever it takes to get out, as long as I'm not infringing legally on somebody else's territory, I just want to be done with the project. You know, and here's a case where you do 85 minutes of music in a week and a half or something, and you're just a wreck, naturally. And Jim doesn't have the sensibility to know what he's asked of you. He's complaining that the cue between the 3 seconds that's between there and there doesn't work at all for him. And you're saying, listen, you're lucky to have anything. You get into these predicaments sometimes, and you just learn how to deal with it and unplug yourself and move on.
I didn't realize there was so much like relational problems like that.
Oh, it happens all the time. I mean, Awakenings. Randy Newman and what's her name, the director, the girl, the woman that used to be on the Penny Marshall. I mean, Randy wanted to shoot her. Now you'd never know it from the score, but the score was taken out, put in, taken out, put in. Penny didn't know what she wanted. She changed it around and around and around. She put cue. She attached the ankle to the neck. She took the nose and attached it to the big toe. She did. It was like that. And then she'd say, well, this doesn't work anymore for me. And then Randy was, you know, you don't even know where to begin with somebody like that. That's another case where I don't think Randy will be working with Penny again. Music is the most abstract thing you can really discuss. Somehow the typewritten page, or you're discussing a story about a submarine, somehow discussing it, it's going to be a war movie, or it's going to be about a Russian sub that gets into American hands or wants to defend. Somehow that's less abstract. But when you talk about chord progressions or how you want the emotions to flow, it's so abstract that music very often can go astray between two people, a director and a composer.
Any other questions back there? Yeah.
It's a really complicated subject, but it's probably the most common among aspiring film composers is one of orchestration, and there are so many questions to ask, but I'm always curious as to how a composer works with the director on certain ideas of the piano, and how does the director know what it's going to sound when it's orchestrated, and how difficult it is to work with an orchestrator, or how much of it is already orchestrated when you give it to somebody who orchestrates?
It all depends. There are people that don't orchestrate at all, and in fact don't write at all, but somehow realize their scores on a synthesizer or whatever. Michael Convertino is an example. He wrote the score for Children of a Lesser God and The Doctor. Now, he doesn't write music per se. It's sort of realized. The term realized is it's sort of performed into a machine, into a synthesizer, a synclavier in this case, and an orchestrator listens to the machine and orchestrates what he hears in the machine. There are other people that do it from the beginning to the end. They compose and they orchestrate themselves. I come out of more of that school because of my background, because I know a lot about orchestration, and to me orchestrating is just like painting. I can't conceive of making a charcoal sketch and handing it over to a colorist and saying, here, you put in the colors. I mean, to me, it's part and parcel with composition. Going against that, of course, is the fact that I only have 5 or 6 weeks to do a score. And if I'm only doing 3 minutes a day of a fully orchestrated score, I'm going to run out of time very fast. So, in my case, what I tend to do is I sketch the music out on big orchestral paper and I orchestrate as I go along. But I probably only get about 60 or 70% of the orchestrations done before I hand it off to an orchestrator. And by orchestrations, for those who aren't musicians, we're talking about taking a melodic idea and deciding, is it going to be played by the tuba or is it going to be played by the oboe? And if the oboe plays it, what is the harmony going to be played with? What are the violins going to do? What are the drums going to do? All of that stuff. And I try to orchestrate as much as I can given the time allotments and time constraints.
Is this the so-called ghost writers that, I know they're because there are orchestrators in film that are given credit, but there's also these so-called ghost writers who do small sections. Is that still something that exists?
Yeah. ghostwriting is you have to be very careful when you talk about ghostwriting. Ghostwriting is what happens when a composer doesn't write the music himself. He takes credit for it, but he farms it out to some other guy to do the writing. I don't think it happens that often. I think it happens more in television, where a composer will take credit for the music, but actually he's doing 4 TV shows a week and he can't do it all, so he farms it out to other people. You do get examples of, I'll tell you a very good example, like, and this is one of the things that's so infuriating about music and the Academy and all of this. The Little Mermaid. The guys that wrote The Little Mermaid are wonderful songwriters, no doubt, and Beauty and the Beast, wonderful songwriters. And they use a whole bank of orchestrators to orchestrate the songs. They also use the same bank of people to write the filler music between the songs, i.e. the score itself. They'll give them a theme, a thematic idea, but it's very much woven by the orchestrator. Now, fair enough, you get to the Academy Awards situation, and they're nominated for a Best Song. No problem with that. When it comes time to be nominated for Best Score, however, I have a major problem with that, because they didn't actually write the score on a hands-on level. They fleshed out melodic ideas, but it was filled in by experts at orchestration. Mary Poppins is the same example. The Sheridan brothers wrote that song that Dick Van Dyke dances to on the roofs of London, and it goes on for 8 minutes. Now, that was what the Sheridans gave the orchestrator. The sequence goes on for 8 minutes. It goes through every permutation of that, orchestration of that. It goes on and on and on, and he did a remarkable job. Unfortunately, the Shermans get the credit for that. And it's really not right. Now, with the way the Academy is, and with the way that financial pressures are on the Academy, and believe it or not, because of the televised screenings of the Academy, they have taken out technical categories. Music has lost Best Song Score. Music has lost Best Adaptation. For instance, if I did an adaptation now of Sound of Music for movie, or Cats, I would never get nominated. There's no category anymore for me. That's gone. And a lot of that, the reason that's gone is because in audience viewing, the audience wants to see the movie star stuff, but all the tech awards, they don't care about. Sound effects were going to be voted out, but they're still kept in this year, maybe next year. But within the next 5 years, you're going to see probably sound effects will go, best sound go. Those kind of things are going to drop. And we've lost 2 categories in music, in the music division. So now when you get a movie like Beauty and the Beast that's obviously hugely successful, a lovely score, lovely songs, a lovely movie, and there's a whole lot of hype about it, you still have the situation where you have songs that have been adapted with score, etc., and it's nominated for Best Score. Is that right? And I don't think it's right. But there's nothing that can be done, because that's the sort of, that's the category it falls into.
Now, all the members of the Academy, regardless of whether or not they're musicians or have musical background, can vote for these musical categories?
No, it starts with the music branch.
Okay.
Each branch, except for Best Picture, each branch votes on their category. The music branch votes on Best Picture and all the music junk. The cinematographers vote on Best Photography and Best Picture. The editors vote on Best Editing and Best, etc. Each branch does this. When it comes time to music, and there's a great deal of hype behind a film, and the songs are hugely successful, people can't differentiate between good songs and good score. To them it's just, hey, that was great music, wasn't it? And that's very much how the Academy works. That's how a lot of people work. That's great music, wasn't it? Is how a lot of directors approach composers. They don't have an idea that there were orchestrators or that the magic evolved differently. It was great music, and that's very much how the things are very much nominated. And what's also very interesting is how there can be a backlash against a filmmaker like Steven Spielberg and a score like Hook, which eminently deserves Best Score nomination over Beauty and the Beast, because, again, remembering that Beauty and the Beast was not, the score was not written by the songwriters per se, and it doesn't get nominated. There's a tremendous amount of injustice that goes along on a purely technical level in the Academy Awards, in the music branch.
This is almost not quite as bad, but we discussed, Michael Green will be here next week from Norris. In music now, where technologically you can splice so much together, well, what happened with Milli Vanilli, for example, where technologically this is becoming a new art form, and in the case of the music industry, people aren't even singing anymore, for example. You're talking basically about the same kind of thing where a person is getting credit for a score, and yet that ability, that capability, that skill is really not there.
No, it's not really there. Again, you don't want to, I want to be very careful, because I have no problems with best song score or best adaptation of songs or a score woven from songs, but there is no category for that. So it falls under best score. And it's very interesting because it happens, it really does happen all the time. And again, the aesthetics of music being what they are, music is so abstract that people say, gee, that was great music, and they don't really know what went into it or what all the, they're just going by a purely emotional reaction of the music as married to a picture. Another example is, I don't know how many of you saw The Mission, but to me the score of The Mission was a unique piece of music against a picture. I mean, it was a really beautiful marriage of taking an idea of sort of, with the chorus and the instruments, and sort of marrying it to a conventional orchestral score. It was really quite wonderful. It got nominated, rightly so. Got nominated the same year as Aliens got nominated, and I voted for The Mission over and above my own score. Partly was a reaction to Jim Cameron and the whole thing. I thought The Mission was truly the best score of the year. I wish I would have been given the opportunity to do that. Okay. Round Midnight, Herbie Hancock is nominated. Okay. Now there's 45 minutes of music in Herbie Hancock's film, of which 10 is original music. The rest are oldies but goldies that have been arranged and performed by Herbie or variations thereof. It gets the Academy Award as Best Score. It makes no sense to me. You lose so much faith in people's decision-making processes when it comes time to music after something like that. How 10 minutes of original music with all the pre-extant music could win over The Mission is very hard. The way it works is that the Academy at large, even the music branch, doesn't know the difference. They just say great music. They don't know that most of it was pre-existing. They don't know that. They think Herbie did it all.
Right.
And so that's where it goes. And the aesthetics of all of this stuff are amazing. It's just all over the place. So when you come to a situation where going in, it's difficult enough to write music for a film with a director you've never met or worked for before. It can't be anything like you've done before for somebody else. Chances are that it's going to be judged on a level which is more visceral than artistic. it's a very difficult profession to be in. I mean, I wouldn't do anything else, but more and more I question what I'm doing writing music against film. It's more and more difficult. But then again, I'm burdened by that I see it as an art form again, and not as just, gee, you know, screw it, it doesn't matter. As long as I get my paycheck, it doesn't matter. I can't do that emotionally.
James, I know that you have an appointment at 2:30.
I do.
It's 10 after 2. Were there any final comments or?
I think it's a shame that you're exploited. All artists seems like, I guess, here in LA. And it's just a shame because, you know, it's like you're kind of drawn away from.
It's not so much exploitation because it's not, the actual exploiters are, you sort of spot them and they get a reputation, and unless you really need the money, you don't work for them. But what does happen is because music is so abstract, and you say, and a director says, I want a Civil War score from you. Well, what's that mean to you, or what's that mean to you? Civil War score to me meant what I did for Glory. But when we first started, Civil War score was Battle Hymn of the Republic. That's where I started with Ed Zwick. He wanted Battle Hymn of the Republic. He wanted all the battle sequences to be scored. It was more like how the West was won than what I did. And over the course of 8 weeks, you gradually change somebody's mind. You gently work the situation. But with Glory, I played everything, or most everything, most of the themes on the piano, which is the best I can do for him. One of the themes that I wrote, he thought was in the wrong movie. He thought it was a love theme. He said it's in the wrong movie. It's a beautiful, beautiful theme, but it's in the wrong movie. And I knew he was wrong. I didn't see it as a beautiful theme. I saw it as a sort of a yearning theme. It was longing. And I said, Ed, you can't tell when I play it on the piano, because it does. It sounds really crappy here, and it does sound like it should be in Summer of '42 and not in Glory. But he was so unsure that I did 3 major sequences with an alternate theme that he liked better. Just in case I got to the scoring stage, the recording stage, and he would have a fit, and he would say, see, I told you, it should have been in Summer of '42, it shouldn't have been here. So I did 3 major cues, 2 different ways. Now, when we actually got to the recording stage, the very first cue I started with one of these 3, and I started with my version. And it was obvious that that was the way to go. And he came out, and he said, that sounds great. And he went back in, and that was the end I ever heard of Summer of '42 and all of the nonsense. But what an amount of work I went to cover myself and to cover him in the movie, just in case he felt the same way at the recording sessions.
Mm-hmm. Because then you're talking about a lot of money being spent in one
Well, you're
hour.
talking about, yeah, I mean, money goes by very fast there when you're dealing with 100 people in front of you, and if there are any rewrites, or he doesn't like something and you send the orchestra home, or they throw it out and you have to call an orchestra back to redo it, it's a fortune. Plus we also had this boys' choir, the Boys' Choir of Harlem, which was a real risk because I was told very nicely, with a good sense of humor, but you always know that there's a dagger somewhere. I was told, you know, that basically I was going to have my head handed to me if this didn't work out, because we had to fly this boys' choir in from London, from New York, with the guys that watch over the kids during the day. You have to pay them as though they were going to school, and you have to provide a tutor for them. There's a whole thing that works out. You don't just get a bunch of kids in for 8 hours and send them back to a motel room. It's a whole thing. So it ended up costing close to $70,000 just to bring them here and get them back to New York before you paid them anything. Just airfares and hotel and food and tutor. Before, and the studio was beside themselves. They thought that if this didn't work out, this was going to be a huge disaster. Mind you, on the day of the recording, all the executives are down there partaking of the magic, and it was a magical experience having this black boys choir there. It was great, and they are great. And everybody wants to be part of the magic, but what happens up front is no one's thinking about the magic or the sound. They're thinking about sheer bottom line, and you get a lot of middle-level management people who say, well, can we do it with a choir from Pasadena? Why does it have to be a black boys choir? Now, when they say, why does it have to be a black boys choir and its glory, you want to say, hey, pal, haven't you you know, it's like, but that's what you deal with, you know, right and left.
Well, James, thank you very much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
You learned a lot, and you really touched on a lot of areas that we've been discussing. It's amazing, isn't it? The way an artist really thinks about these so-called aesthetics in various ways, besides need to be expected. So we thank you very much, and good luck.
Thanks for having me.